If torture in hell is personalized, I fear the devil will barely have to lift a finger for me. It's a good thing that I enjoy living in New York City so much, because if I didn't, I would fear that I was already there. Heat and crowds, I'm not exaggerating when I say that if I have a psychotic break, it'll be in the sweltering summer heat while lugging my junk-laden work bag through what can only be described as a tourist battleground. And the weather in the last week, mid-80s or 30-ish, depending on your persuasion, has been testing me. Unbearable humidity, beads of sweat dripping down like bugs crawling on my back, every time I dare step out of my icy air-conditioned office in Midtown. And the smells. Why does such a wonderful city bless us with such smells? I described it to my friend over text this week as urine-soaked garbage with a lingering hint of unidentifiable. Maybe I was already on edge this week after a rather torturous trip out to Hoboken on Tuesday for dinner for a friend of mine from work. There's nothing wrong with Hoboken. Well, there's nothing really wrong with Hoboken. But if you're thinking of making the journey across state lines for the first time in a long time, I dare say you should not trek by foot from Midtown East through Times Square to Port Authority at 5 p.m. in 87-degree weather with coworkers, who's familiar with the bus terminal is just as subpar as your own. Sweat soaked through our collared shirts and blouses. Buttons were lost. Nervous breakdowns were had. There were no tears, but we were red in the face and desperate for a drink by the time we made it to New Jersey. I did have one coworker, who I'd like to give credit to, suggest about halfway through this misguided walk that we catch a bus to take us to Port Authority rather than carry on. We nodded as enthusiastically as our sticky selves could, parking ourselves in the crowd by the stop. Not a minute later, we watched as the most human-infested bus we had ever seen outside of pictures pulled up. One or two people from the crowd pushed their way in and the rest of us barely gave the bus another glance before trudging on. Yeah. My coworker said, words all slow and drawn out. We glanced at the time, it was 5:20. Rush hour, we weren't sure why we'd expected anything else. I took the 2, a subway that runs up and down the west side. Home that night from Port Authority. It was delayed. I feel like it's always delayed, the week continued, and despite the heat, the social events did too. Art show in Brooklyn on Wednesday. The L, a line that runs from the west of Manhattan to deep into Brooklyn, worked. Sort of. One broke down so they told every to get off and head to the other one. But I made it there, eventually, and it got me home alright. Sports League on Thursday, so hot that the messages in the group chat leading up to it were all just reminders that read like pleas for everyone to remember deodorant. I took not 1, not 2, but 3 different subways to get there. The 7 to the B to the F. I won't even explain these ones. They twist and turn, and if you ask me, there had to have been a better way. The stations were their own inferno, like standing in a sauna or a steam room, where instead of water or stones they use piss on the rail tracks. Yesterday's 7:30 a.m. commute was fine. I dropped my dog at daycare and carried on to the 4 at Union Square, which even at those hours was kind of acting up. I know technically speaking Friday was not the hottest day of the week. Maybe it was my body giving up on me, but I was hot, beyond hot. I was reaching temperatures that should have a person hospitalized before I stumbled into my office. I took a walk in the afternoon. I think I was lulled outside by the bright sunshine through the half-closed window sheers. The cold air conditioning made me forget what I knew to be true, the outside was actually unbearable. A few blocks later, and I came to my senses. No more of that nonsense. It should come as no surprise that by the time I was heading home Friday evening I was desperate to not send myself back down into the depths of the subway. I couldn't stand the heat. Nor the crowds. Nor the inconsistency. I think I might hate the subway, if I'm being honest with myself. The taxis were looking awfully appealing, but that felt pathetic. My coworker's words from Tuesday rang in my ear. What about a bus? Indeed, sure enough, there was a bus route that I could catch only a few blocks up from my office that dropped me only 3 blocks from my dog's daycare. I couldn't believe it. I had been such a bus loyalist when I lived on the east side, singing the praises of the air conditioning, the USB ports, and, really, the fact that people behave above ground. Oh, I loved a good bus. So to learn of, maybe not a perfect bus route, but a very reasonable bus route was immensely exciting to my subway-leery self. I knew as I started walking over, the time was an issue. I was setting myself up for a rush hour bus once again, but I figured as just one person I could be the squeezer. The person with the headphones on, slinking into the empty crevasses left by the shapes of human bodies, staring intently at the floor, trying their very best to pretend that they do not see that they have inconvenienced a single soul. Now I will preface the following with 2 acknowledgements. Firstly, bus stops are often deceptively labeled, and secondly, no one claims to really know when the bus is coming. But I caught a bus yesterday whose number doesn't seem to correspond to any active route, at a time where no buses should have been coming. And I was the only one that got on. The crowds had condensed to a level that I had never seen before in the city. I think I'm rather strategic about where I go, particularly in the summer months, and the bus was starting to seem like a mistake as I clawed my way through the never-ending sea of tourists. They were slow, and bumbling along, crowding sidewalks and blocking streets. I dodged and swerved like my life depended on it, and I was starting to feel like it really did. I could feel their eyes on me as I silently begged them to move once the stoplight changed. They wouldn't be persuaded before then. I always wonder if I become part of a tourist attraction when I'm like this, so obviously there for work. To live, oblivious to the sights around me, moving at a pace so unlike theirs. I am different from them. I wonder if they see it as much as I do. I like to think I've gotten used to the city. It's not unlike where I grew up. But there was something about last night that set me on edge. The natural, unnatural swells of people, like I was trapped in a riptide, getting pulled out to sea. I couldn't seem to catch my breath, the hot air hardly satiating my lungs. My headphones were slick against my skin, digging my glasses, askew from the commotion, painfully into the sides of my face. I saw the M1 come, and then go before I could get to it, and I wondered if I was about to have a panic attack there on 5th Avenue, surrounded by people who seemed just thrilled to be there. I checked my phone and the M3 was supposed to come in 10 minutes. I would just have to walk a little further to catch it. I'd make it. I'd make it, I reassured myself. What other option did I have? I was about halfway down the block, when I saw what I thought at first was the M3 pulling up. It was strange, it was as though the whole stop was an afterthought. It had slammed on its brakes only 20 yards ahead of me, its front angled right at the sidewalk with its rear jutting off into the street. I wasn't at a stop, not really, but I took off at a run, desperate to catch this bus that promised to pull me from the depths of hell I had just wandered into. As I got closer, I realized that the number didn't say M3, it said M13. It's a combination, I assured myself in a way that only desperation could allow, a combination of the M1 and the M3. It will take me where I want to go. I boarded without a second thought, only somewhat cognizant of the fact that no one else was getting on behind me. I said hello to the bus driver as I boarded, and I wish I knew now what he said in response. Because he did say something, but my headphones were too loud to hear it. The door closed behind me, and as I made the turn into the bus, the first thing that struck me was that there were only 2 others on board. In the entire bus, in the middle of rush hour. On the most crowded street I had ever walked in the city, there were only 3 of us on the bus. How fabulous is that, I thought to myself as I took a seat near the middle, somewhere in between the 2 other passengers. I put my bags on the chair next to me and leaned back enjoying the AC. The older lady a few rows behind me, cackled before returning to some video she was watching out loud. It took me a second to place whether it was her, or the guy in front of me, sitting in one of the sideways facing seats. He looked about my age. I could hear the noise through my headphones, it sounded like a lecture. I loathe when people listen to things out loud, but I resisted the urge to turn around. and confirm it was her. I was just too happy to be on the bus. It took me a minute or two to notice, but it did eventually dawn on me that all of the lights were off on the bus and the sign that usually displays the next stop was blank. This, more so than the lack of passengers, surprised me, though I can't say why. Maybe it was the contrast, because despite the very regular number of windows, it was noticeably dark inside the bus. The next 10 minutes or so were unnotable, outside of perhaps the lack of stops. I occasionally changed the song on my phone, but mostly I stared out the window. We hit some traffic, and the bus took to congestion like I took to tourists, bobbing and weaving us through. I'm not sure we abided by every traffic law, but most. The ones that counted, it was probably 20 blocks into the journey, still not a single stop, when the lady behind me screamed. I whipped around and found that she was a row or two closer than I remembered her being, but otherwise, there she sat. Perfectly calm. In fact, she seemed to be answering a FaceTime call, though when she moved her phone animatedly, I could have sworn that the screen was black. I told myself I missaw it. The guy in front of me had also turned to stare, and he and I exchanged glances before he smiled. He had a nice smile, a warm sort of grin that moved his whole face to execute. Though unconventional, I think we both accepted that screaming must be the old lady's preferred greeting. I really did like his smile, so when he stood up a moment later, I wondered if he was coming over. Instead, his body lurched forward. He stood right at the front of the bus, body bent in half like the letter L. He stood like that for 1 block, 2 blocks, 3 and 4. I've seen a lot of drug users in the city, but this wasn't that. I don't know what this was, but I didn't like it. 30 blocks into the journey and we still hadn't stopped. If anything, we had sped up. The city outside the window panes blurred by. We were running stop lights at this point and no one seemed to notice or care. I have the urge to seem calm even in the strangest of circumstances, and I kept telling myself that unfamiliarity breeds discomfort and this route was new to me. Besides, public transportation is weird sometimes. It would be embarrassing to tweak out, even though my companion seemed to be taking the opportunity to do just that. But the lack of stops was getting to me. Though the crowds blended together into swirl of colors outside the bus windows, there were, undoubtedly, still crowds. Even if neither of the other riders needed to get off, I couldn't believe that no one else wanted to get on. Subtly, I pulled up maps on my phone. It's silly, but after years in the city, I always feel I ought to know how to get to where I want to go. And so I always want to hide when I don't. I just wanted to make sure I knew my stop so that I'd request it on time. It was clear it would take a manual effort, we wouldn't be stopping regardless. I looked up the M13 line, just to confirm that it followed the same route as the M1 or M3. Maps, and then Google, were having nothing to do with my question. If the internet was to be believed, therein lied my problem. The bus I was on, the one with no stops nor people, didn't seem to have any such route to look up. 40 blocks, no stops, a sideways man, and a screamer. Still preferable to the subways, I reassured myself. I would just have to pay attention to the streets. I stared at the man in front of me, when his face began to turn towards me, too slowly, as though he was animatronic, ticking and ticking. He smiled again, this wide smile that puffed up his cheek and lit up his eyes, and I found it far less appealing than I had the first time. Then, almost cautiously, vertebrae by vertebrae he began to stand up straight. I don't know when he looked away from me. I made it a point to fumble through my bag not wanting to engage. By the time I looked back, he had turned his back to me. I wouldn't say he shook off whatever it was that had seized, there was still an unnaturalness to the man's movements afterwards, as though his joints were too stiff and he wasn't quite used to walking. But he moved towards the bus driver and it looked as though he was engaging in a conversation with him, though I couldn't make out any words. Occasionally, he would glance back at me before going back to the driver. I couldn't possibly be the most notable thing on the bus. I snuck a quick glance back to the older lady behind me and my breathing hitched when I noticed there were just 2 rows between us. The first time I could write it off, but I knew she hadn't been 3 rows behind me. I planned to pull the yellow cord within 5 blocks my stop. Well, if not my stop, 5 blocks from the street where the stop was supposed to be. I began counting down. We were getting closer. Still not a single stop, and I really did want to make sure that I could get off. It felt pressing. 7 blocks left and the man kept glancing back. 6 and I felt a prickle in my spine. She was closer. I couldn't bring myself to look back. I couldn't know how close she'd gotten to me. 5 and my hand shot up to pull the yellow. Ding, the stop lit up on the blank sign. My hand hovered aimless at the window, still halfway to the cord. I hadn't pulled for it. I don't know who did. I think I could have dismissed it all as a strange express bus ride had we stopped at the M1 or the M3 stop. But we didn't. We plowed right through those as I pulled the cord and pressed the stop button over and over, bags in hand, and as the stops flew by me out the window, we stopped next to my dog's daycare. The door opened and I stepped out, the harsh sunlight nearly blinding me after the darkness that overwhelmed that bus. No one else followed. I was hesitant to move. I really didn't like the specificity of the stop. But as I glanced back, the older woman and sideways man's faces were pressed against the window panes. I jumped toward the front of the bus. The bus driver was just as focused on me as they were. Stuck behind his glass cage. I don't think any of their eyes left me until the bus pulled away. I don't know what took me home. I searched and searched all last night for a bus route with such few stops or one with any stops near where I had ended up. I do know now, with certainty, that the M13 hasn't existed in New York City since 1993. But I will say, if you're ever desperate and the M13 comes to get you, it will take you where you need to go. I would just make sure that you get off at your stop. I don't think it would appreciate if you carry on any longer.